Welcome back to the deep dive. So, have you ever looked at a government budget, one of those huge documents, and wondered what happens when something critical breaks down?
Right.
Like, say, an ambulance, and it breaks down months after that budget was signed into law.
Mm-hmm.
Well, today's deep dive is for you. We are pulling back the administrative curtain on public finance.
Yeah, we're trying to understand this really intricate and, let's be honest, often politically explosive process of spending money that hasn't, technically been approved yet.
Exactly.
And this all takes us right into that friction point, that spot between executive action on one side
and legislative oversight on the other.
Precisely. And we're analyzing the recent defense from Prime Minister Gaston Brown against some pretty sharp criticism.
That's more about significant government purchases, right?
Vehicles, heavy equipment.
That's it. And opposition MP Sherfield Bowen really zeroed in on this, calling it unauthorized spending that went, and this is the quote, beyond the budget. Okay, so our source material today, it's based entirely on what the Prime Minister said on his recent broadcast. He offered this highly procedural, almost technical justification for his government's actions.
It's a really fascinating case study. It forces you to distinguish between what is, politically charged rhetoric and what might just be a procedural delay that's sort of baked into public administration.
So the Prime Minister he's essentially building his defense on two pillars: necessity and compliance mechanisms.
And that's our mission for you today. We want to clarify the language of that defense. So we're going to unpack three things. First, what makes a purchase routine in government speak?
Second, the exact mechanics of something called a supplementary appropriation.
And third, maybe the most important one, why a financial watchdog might label a transaction unauthorized, even when it's not actually illegal.
Yes, that word is doing a lot of heavy lifting. So we are stripping away the political noise to get to the true structure of financial governance here.
And this isn't just about local politics. This is really about understanding that universal tension in resource allocation.
That clash between administrative necessity, needing to get things done, and these very rigid fiscal schedules.
Exactly. So let's unpack it.
All right, so let's start with the spark, the thing that kicked this whole debate off.
Mm-hmm.
The criticism from opposition MP Sherfield Bowen. He focused on the government acquiring new assets, new vehicles, new heavy equipment.
And when you hear that, right, that an expensive purchase was made, and that purchase was not a specific line item in the annual budget.
Yeah, your first thought is fiscal irresponsibility. It sounds bad.
It's a totally reasonable assumption to make because the annual budget is supposed to be the master plan. It's meant to be a ceiling on spending.
So if the executive branch, the government, just unilaterally decides to go over that ceiling.
Well, it appears, on its face to be an overreach of power. But this is where Prime Minister Brown's defense immediately pivots. He pivots to this concept of necessity.
The demands of operational continuity.
Exactly.
He insists these are routine purchases, that phrase. It feels like it's doing a lot of work here. What examples did he actually use to call these purchases routine? And why does that word even matter?
So he cited some very specific things: trucks, heavy equipment for public works, garbage trucks, and significantly, ambulances.
Okay, I see a theme there.
There's a definite theme. These are not, grand capital projects for future growth.
Like building a new airport or something.
All right. These are replacements for depreciating assets that are critical for maintaining existing essential public services. If a hurricane hits and the heavy equipment you need for road clearance is broken, well, that's immediate crisis.
Or if the garbage trucks fail, you have a public health emergency on your hands.
Precisely.
So let's really explore that tension, the tension between that operational need and the budget cycle.
Yeah.
Because most governments, they approve their budget months in advance. They'll sign off in November 2024 for the entire 2025 fiscal year.
And that budget, it assumes a certain lifespan for the equipment you already have.
But as any fleet manager will tell you, things break down unexpectedly. So what is the director of a public works department supposed to do when the only working backhoe dies in June?
6 months into the fiscal year.
Yeah. Are they supposed to just wait another 6 months for the next budget approval cycle?
And that's exactly where the PM's argument gets its traction. He's saying that waiting just isn't an option when public safety and sanitation are on the line.
So the administrative necessity of replacement, especially for things like ambulances or garbage trucks that are used constantly,
High utilization assets, yeah.
it dictates that the purchase has to be made right away, often by using funds that weren't specifically earmarked for it, or maybe even using credit.
And the decision is driven by that immediate operational need.
But the criticism is still valid.
Yeah.
The money was spent on items that were, quote, not budgeted for. So how does the prime minister acknowledge that procedural gap, while still defending the action?
He's actually quite direct about it. He confirms the exact sequence of events that's causing the controversy. He says the essential purchases happened first,
Okay.
based on executive authority and the sign-off of the Ministry of Finance. Then, he says, supplementary appropriations are done subsequently.
So there it is. That's the admission of the procedural gap. The spending comes before the legislative green light.
That's the heart of it. But then he immediately emphasizes that this sequence spending now, authorizing later, is perfectly normal.
He also said it's consistent with long-standing public finance procedures. That normalization argument, it feels really crucial to his whole defense.
It is.
Is he basically suggesting that the formal budget process is, I don't know, toothless when it's up against real-world operational needs?
He's suggesting that the reality of governing dictates a kind of flexibility that the formal budget just doesn't accommodate. If you have an unforeseen, say, $10 million expenditure for critical assets, the administrative staff knows they have to spend it.
And they know the process to fix the ledger later.
Right. It's the supplementary appropriation.
Sure.
So by saying it's perfectly normal and happened from time immemorial, he's trying to institutionalize this practice of retroactive authorization.
So he's saying, this isn't my government breaking the rules, this is just how the rules actually work in practice.
That's the argument in a nutshell.
That brings up a pretty critical question, though, about the separation of powers. What specific constitutional or, statutory authority allows the executive, the Ministry of Finance, to make a large, unbudgeted expenditure before Parliament approves it?
Well, generally there is some provision for this. Most public finance frameworks will include something, they're often labeled contingency funds or temporary warrant systems.
Okay.
And these grant the Minister of Finance or the Cabinet the authority to approve urgent spending that just can't wait for Parliament to convene and pass a whole new bill.
So it's a necessary power for the continuity of government, for emergencies.
It is. But, and this is huge, but that authority usually comes with a very strict caveat. The expenditure must still be ratified by Parliament through that supplementary appropriation process.
And within a defined, probably short time frame.
Often very short, yes.
So I see. The initial spending is legally sanctioned by executive authority, but that sanction is temporary, it's conditional.
That's a perfect way to put it. The executive is basically taking a short-term financial loan against future legislative approval.
And if that final approval never comes, or if it's delayed for too long, then the executive has effectively usurped the legislature's power of the purse.
Exactly. So the PM is arguing that his government has the necessary executive authority to buy the heavy equipment to keep roads clear.
But the political opposition is focused on the conditionality part. The fact that the administrative machinery required to get that final legislative step done is, well, it's lagging.
And this inherent tension, that's what becomes the fertile ground for political conflict.
So the PM frames it as necessity. We had to buy the truck.
While the opposition frames it as a failure of compliance, you didn't file the paperwork on time.
And that really is the core of the whole debate.
It is. The PM is trying to decouple the operational decision from the administrative timing. He's even accusing the opposition of trying to conflate the issues.
For him, buying the ambulance is a sound and necessary decision.
And the administrative timing, filing the appropriation, that's just bureaucracy. It's subject to delays that are common in government, but it's, fundamentally compliant in its intent.
Can we dig a little deeper on what routine means here? Are these purchases, are they funded from some kind of dedicated depreciation fund? Or are they brand new expenditures that just get added to the deficit? Because that distinction seems really important for the country's financial health.
That is a highly granular but absolutely essential point. If these were simply replacements covered by, say, an existing internally managed depreciation or a sinking fund.
Money that's already been saved up for this exact purpose?
Right. Then the procedural issue would be pretty minor, maybe just a reclassification of funds. But the fact that these purchases require supplementary appropriations strongly suggests they are net new expenditures.
Meaning they exceed the total spending authority that Parliament originally granted?
Yes. which means they are often financed by new borrowing or by drawing down reserves or even diverting funds from other existing budget lines.
And that's why Parliament must eventually approve them.
It's because they represent an unexpected increase in the government liability or its expenditure profile, even if the purchase itself is operationally routine.
So if they are adding to the deficit or increasing the national liability, the stakes of this delayed compliance become much, much higher.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about a missing stamp on a piece of paperwork. It's about the financial world having a year-long gap in understanding the true scope of the nation's financial obligations.
Exactly. And that is the perfect segue into the mechanism itself. Because that mechanism is the only thing standing between these expenses and a charge of, illegal spending.
Okay, so let's define this critical technical mechanism. If the government has already spent the money because of this executive necessity,
Right.
the supplementary appropriation is the tool they use to legally clean up the books. So for you listening, what is the clear, functional definition of this document in the context of what the PM is saying?
A supplementary appropriation is the formal legislative mechanism that's required when an executive expenditure goes over the limits of the original budget bill.
The bill that Parliament passed.
Exactly. It is, in effect, a mini-budget.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could call it a budget amendment that Parliament has to pass after the money has already been spent.
So it formalizes the overspending. It retroactively grants legal authority for the funds that were spent.
That's it. So if the Ministry of Public Works spends an unexpected $8 million on heavy equipment,
Mm-hmm.
the supplementary appropriation is the specific bill that gets presented to Parliament that says, hey, we spent $8 million more than you approved for this line item, and we need your formal sanction now.
Got it. And it must require a lot of justification.
A detailed accounting and justification, yes. And this is where we need to distinguish between the internal process and the external one.
What do you mean?
Well, the PM confirmed that the Ministry of Finance signs off on these appropriations internally.
Okay, so that means the executive branch is all on the same page. The Treasury confirms the money was spent. They verify the figures.
Right. But that is still just an executive document. The crucial step is the formal submission to Parliament.
So until Parliament reviews, debates, and votes on that bill, the spending remains technically non-compliant with the original law.
It hangs in a state of administrative limbo.
And that brings us to the delays that have been acknowledged. What exactly is the extent of the current backlog, according to the Prime Minister?
He was pretty open about it. He said the filings are currently about 1 year in arrears.
A year behind.
A year behind. But as soon as he acknowledged the delay, he immediately used that normalization argument again. He asserted that a 1-year lag is not unusual within the historical context of their public finance procedures.
So that's the defense strategy. Manage expectations by appealing to what he calls established administrative reality.
That's right.
But let's not just gloss over what a 1-year delay actually means for oversight. It means that legislative committees, auditors, the public, they're always looking at the government's financial decisions in the rearview mirror.
Absolutely.
So when the legislature debates this supplementary appropriation in late 2025, they're actually debating spending that happened all the way back in 2024.
And that lag, it really affects the quality of any kind of forensic audit or legislative scrutiny.
How so?
Well, it severely limits the effectiveness of oversight. The whole purpose of parliamentary oversight isn't just to rubber stamp things that happened in the past.
No, it's supposed to identify and correct poor spending practices right away.
Exactly. So if a legislative committee finds, a year later, that the government overpaid for a bunch of trucks, what can they do? The contract is already signed, the money is gone, and any corrective action is, well, it's difficult, if not impossible.
And I imagine timely forensic audits, the kind that look for fraud or waste while the trail is still hot, those are also compromised.
They're completely compromised.
Yeah.
Key witnesses might have moved on, memories fade, documents get misplaced.
And what about the impact on external financial bodies? I'm thinking of, international lending institutions or credit rating agencies. When they look at a country's books, a year-long delay in compliance and a gap in legislatively approved spending, that's got to set off some alarm bells.
It absolutely can. Transparency and timeliness are core metrics for fiscal responsibility. Institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, sovereign credit rating agencies, They watch this stuff very closely.
So a continuous pattern of lagging compliance, even if it gets fixed eventually.
It suggests a weak administrative capacity, or it suggests a system where executive authority is routinely overriding legislative control.
And that systemic weakness could be factored into a country's risk profile. It could make borrowing more expensive down the line.
Without a doubt. The lack of a complete legislatively sanctioned financial picture for 12 months creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is always penalized by the market.
Okay, so we understand the problem. What's the plan to fix it? The PM did offer some specific dates and targets for clearing this administrative debt.
He did. He specified that the internal work is focused on bringing the records up to date, at least to November or December of last year. So the full accounting for 2024's spending is being compiled right now.
And the political promise.
The definitive promise is that the compiled documentation, which he vividly described as a whole stack of supplementary appropriations, is scheduled for submission when Parliament reconvenes on December 4th, 2025.
That specific date is the administration's own self-imposed deadline. That's the benchmark they set for themselves to get back into full compliance.
It is.
And a whole stack. That phrase implies a huge administrative undertaking. Can you break down the complexity of compiling all these documents for retroactive approval?
It's far more complex than just, tallying up receipts. It's a massive job.
I'm sure.
First, they have to identify every single instance where a department went over its budget ceiling.
For routine needs, right.
Then they have to gather the original internal executive approvals, that Ministry of Finance sign-off for each one.
Okay.
Third, they have to draft a compelling narrative justifying the operational necessity of each purchase. That involves getting input from all the different department heads, public works, health, sanitation.
And finally, they have to translate all of that into the correct legal format for Parliament to review.
And given you're talking about the accumulated spending for an entire year on everything from, paper clips to heavy machinery, this compilation is a massive effort that would strain the resources of any Ministry of Finance.
And that inherent strain connects back to the PM's admission about past delays.
Mm-hmm.
He mentioned that at one point his government inherited a situation where these filings were 3 to 4 years behind schedule. That historical admission, even though he's framing it as an improvement story, it really highlights how chronically under-resourced or, structurally challenged this whole administrative system must be.
It certainly does. If a government can fall 3 or 4 years behind, it implies that the statutory requirement for timely submission is regularly ignored in favor of more immediate operational demands.
Like just making payroll.
Exactly. So by submitting this stack in December 2025, the PM is trying to stabilize the administrative compliance at a 1-year lag.
And he's arguing that this is the best, most practical outcome for a system that's under constant strain. And hey, it's an improvement over what it used to be.
But we have to remember, a 1-year lag is still a lag.
Right. It's a political maneuver. You claim success by comparing your current performance to a historical failure.
But the crucial point remains that all of this hinges on that distinction between the internal financial sign-off and the external legal compliance.
Which brings us to that scary word.
Unauthorized.
Yes, that term, unauthorized. It's the sharp end of the political spear that the opposition is wielding.
It's a very loaded word.
It is. So when the Director of Audit reviews the government's books and flags spending as unauthorized, it sounds like a smoking gun for corruption.
Of course.
So how did Prime Minister Brown address this specific terminology?
This was probably the most critical clarification of his entire broadcast. He really emphasized that in this procedural context, the label unauthorized does not mean wrongdoing, or corruption, or illegality.
And that distinction is vital, because politically, those two terms, unauthorized and illegal, they are often deliberately conflated.
They absolutely are.
Okay, so let's really unpack that. If a payment has the internal sign-off of the Ministry of Finance, how can an independent body like the Director of Audit still label it unauthorized? Where's the authorization missing from?
The authorization that's missing is the final supreme legal authority,
Right.
And that belongs to Parliament. Remember, it was Parliament that passed the original Appropriations Bill. That set the legal ceiling for spending. So any spending above that ceiling, even if it was necessary, is technically outside the legal framework of that bill.
So the Ministry of Finance's sign-off, that only provides executive clearance.
Right. It confirms the need and maybe the availability of funds, but it does not and cannot replace the legislative mandate from Parliament.
So the director of audit in their statutory duty is simply reporting on whether the government is adhering to the law.
Exactly.
And if the original law, the Appropriations Bill, was breached, then the audit director has to use the terminology that reflects that breach.
They have to. Lacking authorization from the legally designated body, which is Parliament.
So the PM himself clarified this, right? He said the spending is just that the supplementary appropriations were not filed in time.
He's basically arguing that the intent was always compliant. The spending was necessary. But the procedural cleanup, the legislative finalization, was delayed.
So it's a failure of timeliness, not a failure of law or integrity.
That's the argument he's making.
Okay, so let's try that small business analogy we talked about before, just to make this really clear for you.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
So imagine you manage a large nonprofit organization, and your board has approved a $1 million operational budget for the year.
Okay. And inside that budget, you have $5,000 set aside for server maintenance.
Right. But halfway through the year, your critical server completely fails. It threatens the entire organization's data, everything.
A total crisis.
So your IT director, they immediately use an emergency credit line to buy a brand new server system for $50,000, and they save the organization.
So the spending decision, the $50,000, was necessary. It had operational sign-off from the executive director, but it blew past the $5,000 budget line.
Way past it. Now, your internal financial controls require that transaction to be immediately logged and the spending variance noted.
And you promise your board that you'll present a motion for a budget reallocation and retroactive approval at the next board meeting.
Which is 3 months away.
Okay, so now imagine an external auditor shows up 1 week before that board meeting. They start reviewing the books.
And they see the $50,000 expenditure that goes way over the board-approved $5,000 limit.
What do they do?
The auditor must flag that $45,000 difference as an unauthorized expenditure.
Not because the purchase was corrupt or unnecessary?
No, but because it currently lacks the final formal approval of the governing body. In this case, the board. In the government's case, Parliament.
The auditor is just making sure the organization's spending adheres to the governance structure set by the board.
That's their only job in this context.
That makes the distinction crystal clear. The payment is unauthorized in a procedural technical sense because the legislative paperwork is late, even though the internal executive sign-off confirmed its necessity.
And this distinction is crucial for how you interpret this politically.
Because when opposition MP Bowen uses the word unauthorized, he's relying on that negative connotation to imply something much worse than a 1-year delay in filing paperwork.
Of course. He's hoping you hear illegal or corrupt.
Yeah.
And the PM is pushing back hard on that conflation, insisting the issue is administrative capacity, not criminal intent.
Let's talk for a second about the specific role of the Director of Audit. What gives them the power to flag these payments, and what kind of teeth does the report actually have?
The Director of Audit's authority is usually enshrined right in the national constitution and in specific audit acts. Their mandate is to examine and report on how public funds are handled.
Specifically checking if spending aligns with the appropriation laws passed by Parliament.
That's their core function.
Yeah.
Now, their power isn't to prosecute. Their power is the power of public exposure and formal reporting to the legislature.
Okay, so then what happens if the PM fails to meet that December 4th, 2025 deadline? What if Parliament doesn't pass the supplementary appropriations? What are the specific consequences?
Well, the consequences would escalate significantly. If the government fails to submit that stack, or if Parliament, for some reason, refuses to pass the bill,
then that spending is no longer just procedurally delayed.
it would become permanently unratified expenditure. And depending on the specific laws of the country, that could lead to a motion of censure, a vote of no confidence.
Or even worse.
In extreme cases, if there were deliberate attempts to hide spending, it could lead to potential legal challenges, sanctions, or even fines for the people involved in making those spending decisions.
So the commitment to submit by December 2025 is basically the administration's public promise to avoid moving from a simple compliance issue to a legitimate constitutional crisis.
That's it. Submitting the documents, even a year late, is the government mitigating its own risk. It turns a potential constitutional violation into what they hope is seen as a minor administrative reprimand.
It's an act of good faith. It shows they're committed to the compliance framework, even if they're operating on an aggressive timeline.
It demonstrates that the executive recognizes the supremacy of the legislature's power of the purse and is actively seeking that ratification. The entire defense of the administration rests on the successful and, inevitable completion of that final legislative step.
And if the scale of unfiled appropriations reached hundreds of millions, as the PM alleged about the past, then we are talking about a period where that potential constitutional crisis was just hanging over the nation's finances for years and years.
That is the horrifying implication of the historical context the PM brought up, which brings us to how he used the past to defend the present.
Right. So Prime Minister Brown's defense, it transitioned very smoothly from this procedural explanation into a political counterattack.
Oh, it's a very classic pivot.
He didn't just defend his own administration. He immediately accused the opposition, the United Progressive Party, or UPP, of being hypocritical given their own past financial record.
And that's a highly effective political maneuver. It introduces the idea of systemic failure. It suggests this is a problem that's endemic to the structure of governance here, not something specific to the current political party in charge.
It dilutes the current criticism by pointing to a far worse historical precedent.
Exactly.
So let's get into the specifics of his claims against the UPP administration, the one led by Baldwin Spencer. What was the core accusation about their financial compliance?
The prime minister alleged that during the previous Baldwin Spencer-led administrations, I think the quote was 104 years in office, they failed to execute this crucial compliance mechanism.
Which was?
He said they didn't file a single supplementary appropriation.
A single one.
In 10 years.
Not one, according to the PM.
Wow. Okay, so 10 years without filing a single appropriation? That suggests a complete breakdown of the legislative oversight mechanism.
A shocking claim.
We just established that these supplementary appropriations are the legal mechanism to validate any over-budget spending. So if none were filed for a decade, it implies that massive amounts of public money were spent without any formal legislative ratification whatsoever.
It implies that the executive branch, for a whole decade, just ignored the statutory requirement to seek retrospective parliamentary approval for all spending that exceeded the budget.
That's a profound lapse.
Yeah.
It suggests that year after year, the government was just operating under its own self-granted authority, essentially bypassing the core accountability function of the legislature.
And the PM used this historical claim to quantify the massive burden his administration then inherited when they took office in 2014. What was the scale of that inherited compliance debt?
He claimed his administration had to process hundreds of millions of dollars in unfiled appropriations left behind by the former government.
Hundreds of millions.
That figure, hundreds of millions, is the key data point he uses to anchor his entire political argument. It shifts the focus from their current one-year delay to the necessity of fixing what he presents as a monumental, inherited financial mess.
Yeah. Let's just analyze the administrative implications of that number for a second. Processing hundreds of millions in retroactive filings, that's not just paperwork.
Oh, not at all.
You're attempting to reconstruct a financial narrative that spans a decade. You're probably relying on incomplete records, or trying to find personnel who have long since left their posts.
The administrative burden would have been immense. Bordering on prohibitive. It would require dedicated teams inside the Ministry of Finance to go back through years of bank statements, contract logs, invoices, departmental requisitions.
Trying to assign justification and sign off for spending that was, by then, ancient history.
And all that work. It ties up vital financial personnel. It diverts resources away from managing current financial stability and planning for the future.
So it essentially forces the current administration to audit and clean up the previous government's book before they can even get around to filing their own compliant records.
And that's the context he's creating. This inherent strain provides the justification for why the current administration is still 1 year behind. The PM is basically saying the entire system was so corrupted by the past failure to comply that just stabilizing it at a manageable 1 year lag is a major achievement, not a failure.
I see. So he's reframing the current 1 year delay. It's not a sign of laxity.
No, in his narrative, it's evidence of a continuous effort to maintain a compliance standard that he claims was entirely absent for 10 years.
And the political effectiveness of that argument is pretty undeniable. It turns the accusers into the prime offenders of the very compliance failure they're now complaining about.
It's a powerful rhetorical move.
But let's dig into why an administration might have failed to file a single supplementary appropriation for so long. Is this purely political expediency, or does it reflect deeper systemic issues we should be aware of?
It's likely a combination of factors, and they all illustrate a kind of systemic dysfunction.
Okay, what's factor one?
One would be a simple lack of administrative capacity. If the Ministry of Finance was chronically understaffed or lacked the necessary technical software, the complex, time-consuming process of compiling these documents just falls victim to more urgent tasks.
Like we said, making payroll, managing the debt.
Right. The urgent pushes out the important. 2 would be technical complexity. Public finance laws can be incredibly dense. If the government lacked personnel trained specifically in these compliance mechanisms, they might have just deferred the task until it became completely unmanageable.
And then there's a third, more cynical reason.
Political expediency.
If you don't file the appropriations, then the legislature, and by extension the public, doesn't have to debate the true extent of your overspending until you're long out of office.
That is the crucial third point. By avoiding filing, the government temporarily hides the full financial picture. It insulates itself from political criticism over high levels of spending or unexpected debt accumulation.
It keeps the public debate focused only on the initial approved budget,
rather than the true, higher expenditure figures. And if the issue is chronic and nonpartisan, as the PM implies by bringing up this history, then the system itself is structurally vulnerable to this kind of political manipulation of administrative delay.
The implication for the current debate, then, is severe. When MP Bowen criticizes the one-year delay, the PM's response effectively asks, are you complaining about the delay, or are you complaining that we are actually trying to implement the compliance procedure that your administration ignored entirely?
It successfully moves the debate away from the current administration's performance and puts it into a historical context where the previous standard was zero compliance.
The PM is using the specter of that hundreds of millions inherited backlog to justify the current, and by comparison, lesser administrative lag.
It forces you, the listener, to view the current one-year delay as a relative improvement, even if absolute transparency demands real-time compliance.
This historical context is so vital, especially when we talk about the consistency of oversight. If legislative oversight has been perpetually compromised by these delays, whether it's 1 year or 10 years,
then the executive branch gains immense, unchecked discretion over public funds.
And that is the very definition of weak governance. When the financial records lag that significantly, the government effectively operates with reduced accountability. They're spending public funds under temporary executive approval without any timely review by the elected representatives of the people.
And that is the ultimate danger of normalizing administrative delay in public finance.
So this deep dive into the world of supplementary appropriations, it's really shown us that these big political disputes over spending often boil down to arguments over paperwork and timing.
It's less dramatic than it sounds, but far more important.
We've established that the government is defending its purchases, the ambulances, the trucks, the heavy equipment, as necessary operational requirements, even if they did exceed the original budget.
And we clarified the procedural defense, that a supplementary appropriation is the official, the retrospective mechanism for bringing that over-budget spending into legislative compliance.
The current friction point is that acknowledged one-year delay in this crucial filing process. And critically, we dissected the terminology. We confirmed that when oversight bodies flag spending as unauthorized, it signifies a procedural or a timing failure. It's lacking that final parliamentary approval, not necessarily illegality or corruption, as the opposition might want you to think.
And the administration is taking specific documented steps to clear this one-year backlog. They've committed to submitting that whole stack of appropriations, covering spending up to late last year, when Parliament reconvenes on December 4th, 2025.
That date is the benchmark. That's the date for holding the current administration accountable.
It is.
But the discussion was really elevated by that historical context. The PM's claims of inheriting hundreds of millions in unfiled appropriations from previous administrations.
And that suggests that this delayed compliance isn't a unique flaw of one government, but a persistent, chronic, structural problem in public financial management.
Which leads us to our final thought.
Right. So the core purpose of timely financial oversight is to allow the legislature, the media, and the public to debate, to scrutinize, and to potentially alter spending while those decisions are still relevant.
While they still matter.
Exactly. When compliance consistently lags by a year, the ability of legislative bodies to perform any kind of meaningful proactive check on executive spending is severely compromised. The entire oversight mechanism becomes purely historical. It becomes a forensic report on actions that are already done, dusted, and paid for.
So the provocative thought we want to leave you with is this. If the system is perpetually structured to prioritize immediate operational necessity over timely administrative compliance, And this leads to a normalized, institutionalized 1 year or more lag in financial reporting. What happens to the concept of true governmental accountability? Does the administrative workload effectively shield the executive from the timely scrutiny the public is meant to have?
It's a question of whether the system, which was designed to control spending, is instead functioning to legitimize delays. Is it making retrospective approval a bureaucratic inevitability rather than a meaningful act of legislative oversight?
A profound point to consider as we watch that December 4th, 2025 deadline approach. Thank you for diving deep with us.
Thank you.